Elara Vance existed in the quiet spaces between moments. For 50 years, she had been the soft hum of a well-run house, the scent of fresh linens, the silent witness to a life that was lived around her, but rarely with her. She had married Arthur Vance when she was a young woman of 25, and he a recent widower of 40 with two young children. He was a man of grand ideas and quiet temperament, a man who saw in her a stillness that soothed the chaos of his recent grief. She saw in him a chance at a life, a family, a home. The home was a sprawling stone manor, filled with the ghosts of Arthur's first wife and the loud, demanding presence of his children, Marcus and Clara. From the very first day, Elara understood her role. She was not to be a replacement. She was to be a caretaker. She cared for the children as if they were her own, though they never called her mother. She was always just Elara. She absorbed their youthful anger, their adolescent moods, their adult indifference. She mended their clothes, cooked their favorite meals, and mediated their disputes with their father, always taking the path of least resistance to ensure peace in Arthur's home. She managed the household with an efficiency that rendered her invisible. The bills were always paid, the gardens always bloomed, the pantry was always stocked. The family's life ran on a set of silent, perfectly oiled gears, and Elara was the unseen engineer in the basement, her hands smudged with the grease of thankless effort. She had made herself small, folding her own dreams and desires into tiny, manageable squares and tucking them away in a drawer she never opened. Her own passions, a love for botany and a quiet talent for watercolor, became dormant hobbies, pursued only in the stolen, pre-dawn hours before the house awoke. Arthur, for his part, had been kind in his own distant way. He appreciated the tranquility she brought. He would sometimes place a hand on her shoulder as he passed, a gesture that was meant to convey gratitude, but felt more like an acknowledgement of a service well rendered. He never fought her battles with his children. When Marcus, as a teenager, had sneered that she was little more than a glorified housekeeper, Arthur had simply sighed and retreated to his study. Elara had learned then that her peace was her own to keep. No one else would guard it for her. So she built her fortress of silence and accommodation, a fortress that stood for 5 decades. The children grew up and moved out, but they never moved on. They returned often, their visits less about family connection and more like inspections. Marcus, a man whose ambition had curdled into a perpetual, simmering greed, would walk the halls as if he were already the master of the house. Clara, who had inherited her mother's beauty but none of her warmth, would critique the decor, the food, the very air, with a casual cruelty that still found its mark on Elara's heart. They treated her with a polite, paper-thin condescension that was somehow more painful than outright hostility. She was the old woman who lived with their father, a relic of a past arrangement they were simply waiting to dissolve. Elara saw it. She felt it in their quick, dismissive glances and their conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room. She knew what they were waiting for. And then the waiting ended. Arthur's health, robust for so long, began to fail. The decline was slow at first, then rapid and steep, a final, long descent. Elara became not just a caretaker of the house, but a nurse to the man she had called her husband for half a century. She bathed him, fed him, and read to him from his favorite books on astronomy, his voice too weak to protest when she mispronounced the names of distant nebulae. In those final months, something in him seemed to soften toward her. His eyes would follow her around the room, filled with a silent, unreadable emotion. Sometimes he would grip her hand, his fingers surprisingly strong, and hold on as if he were afraid of drifting away. He never said the words. He never said he was sorry for his distance, for his weakness, for letting his children cast such a long and chilling shadow over her life. But she felt a shift, a current of regret that flowed between them in the quiet of the sick room. Marcus and Clara's visits became more frequent, their concern a poorly worn mask for their impatience. They would confer in hushed, urgent tones in the hallway, their faces tight with calculations. Elara pretended not to hear them discussing the value of the estate, the art, the stocks. She pretended not to see the avarice that burned brightly in their eyes. Arthur died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, the sunlight streaming through the window and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He passed peacefully in his sleep, his hand resting on the bed beside where Elara had been sitting all night. Her first feeling was not grief, but a profound and hollow silence. The hum of the house had stopped. The purpose that had animated her for 50 years had vanished. The funeral was a grand affair, orchestrated by Marcus and Clara to reflect their father's standing, not his character. Elara sat in the front pew, a small gray figure in a sea of dark suits and performative sorrow. She felt like a ghost at her own husband's farewell. The children did not consult her on the arrangements. They did not ask for her input on the eulogy. She was, as she had always been, an afterthought. A week later, they were all gathered in the grand library of the house, the air thick with the smell of old leather in anticipation. Mr. Hemlock, the family's lawyer for decades, sat behind Arthur's massive mahogany desk, his face a grim, professional mask. Marcus and Clara were seated in plush leather armchairs, their postures radiating a smug confidence. They were flanked by their own spouses, who looked equally expectant. Elara sat alone on a hardback chair she had pulled from the corner, feeling small and out of place in the room she had dusted 1,000 times. She had no expectations. She assumed Arthur would have made sure she was cared for, that she would be allowed to live out her days in the only home she had ever known. It was a modest hope, but it was all she had. Mr. Hemlock cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He began to read from the last will and testament of Arthur Vance. The legalese was dense and impenetrable, a river of words that flowed past Elara without meaning. She watched Marcus's face. A slow, satisfied smile spread across his lips as the lawyer detailed the disposition of the main assets. To my son, Marcus Vance, I bequeath the entirety of my stock portfolio and all controlling interests in Vance Holdings, Mr. Hemlock read, his voice a monotone drone. Marcus nodded, a king accepting his crown. To my daughter, Clara Vance Hawthorne, I bequeath the art collection, the properties in the city, and all liquid assets held in savings and investment accounts. Clara's perfectly composed face broke into a brief, triumphant smirk, which she quickly concealed behind a delicate hand. The lawyer continued, parceling out the remainder of a vast and considerable fortune. The cars, the jewelry, the antique furniture, it all went to them. And then came the house. The family home at 1200 Oakhaven Lane and all its contents are to be held jointly by my children, Marcus and Clara. Elara's breath caught in her throat. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through her quiet composure. She looked from Marcus to Clara. They refused to meet her gaze. They were looking at the lawyer, their expressions hungry for the final confirmation. Mr. Hemlock paused, shuffling the papers. He seemed reluctant to continue. He looked at Elara, a flicker of something that might have been pity in his old, tired eyes. And finally, he said, his voice dropping slightly, to my wife, Elara Vance. The room went utterly still. Marcus leaned forward, his brow furrowed in annoyance, as if this final clause was an irritating loose end. To Elara, the lawyer repeated, who has been my companion for 50 years, I leave this single, sealed envelope, to be given to her by my own hand. Mr. Hemlock reached into his briefcase and produced a simple, cream-colored envelope. It was thin. It looked impossibly, insultingly small. He stood and walked around the desk, extending the envelope to Elara. Her hand trembled as she took it. It felt weightless, empty. A choked, incredulous laugh escaped from Marcus. An envelope? He said, his voice dripping with derision. After 50 years, He leaves her an envelope? Clara joined in, her laughter a high, brittle sound. Well, what did you expect, Elara? A reward for services rendered? Father was always practical. He paid for your room and board for 5 decades. I'd say that settles the account. The cruelty of the words was breathtaking. They were not whispered. They were announced, for the lawyer, for the spouses, for the very walls of the room to hear. This was her humiliation. Public, complete. She was erased. She was eliminated. I believe that concludes the reading of the will, Marcus said, standing up and smoothing the front of his expensive suit. He looked down at Elara, his face a mask of cold dismissal. We'll need the house cleared by the end of the week. We intend to sell, and we can't have you underfoot during the viewings. Elara couldn't speak. The air had been stolen from her lungs. She could only clutch the thin envelope in her hand, the paper crinkling under the desperate pressure of her fingers. 50 years of her life. 50 years of devotion, of sacrifice, of silent, thankless service. And it had all been reduced to this. A cruel joke. A final, dismissive wave of the hand from beyond the grave. She had been a fool to believe her quiet loyalty had earned her anything more than a temporary space to occupy. She had built her life on the foundation of this family, and with a few callous words they had demolished it, leaving her standing in the rubble with nothing but a single, pathetic envelope. She finally looked up, her gaze meeting Marcus's. There was no pity there, only a chilling, triumphant finality. She was nothing to him. She was nothing. Elara left the library without a word, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. She walked up the grand staircase to the room she had shared with Arthur, the envelope held tight in her hand. Her heart, which she had guarded so carefully for so long, felt as if it had shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sinking under her slight weight. The room was filled with the scent of him, the faint aroma of his pipe tobacco and old books. It was a torment. Her hands, still trembling, fumbled with the seal of the envelope. She expected a letter, perhaps a few $100s, a final, paltry tip. She tore it open. Inside there was no letter. There was no cash. There was only a single folded document and a small, heavy object that slid into her palm. She unfolded the paper first. It was a deed, a property deed, the paper thick and yellowed with age. The legal description was for a plot of land in a place she had never heard of, Port Blossom. The property itself was described as the Stargazer's Rest, an abandoned observatory perched on the coastal cliffs. A faint memory surfaced, a fragment of a conversation from decades ago. Arthur, younger and more animated, talking about a youthful folly, a piece of land he'd bought on a whim, a place to watch the stars, far from the light pollution of the city. He had never mentioned it again. She had assumed he'd sold it long ago. This was her inheritance, a derelict building on a remote cliffside, hundreds of miles away. It was worse than nothing. It was a burden, a mockery, a final, twisted joke. Tears of anger and despair welled in her eyes, blurring the archaic script on the deed. Then she looked at the object in her other hand. It was a key. It was not a modern key. It was made of heavy, tarnished brass, ornate and intricate in its design. The head of the key was shaped into a stylized letter A for Arthur. It was a beautiful object, solid and mysterious. It felt completely out of place with the insulting bequest of a worthless, forgotten property. It was a clue. The thought was a tiny flicker of light in the vast darkness of her despair. But a clue to what? A hidden safe? A box of sentimental trinkets? It couldn't be anything of value. Marcus and Clara would have made sure of that. They had scavenged the entire estate, leaving her with only the bones. The week that followed was a blur of methodical sorrow. Elara packed her life into 2 suitcases. 50 years of existence, condensed into a few changes of clothes, a handful of personal books, her small box of watercolors, and a single, framed photograph of her own parents. She did not take anything that belonged to the house. She did not take anything that belonged to Arthur. She was severing the connection, wire by painful wire. Marcus and Clara were a constant, menacing presence. They shadowed her movements, their eyes cataloging every object she touched, as if they suspected her of trying to steal the silver. They spoke to each other over her head, discussing which real estate agent to hire and how much they could get for the property once it was emptied of all the old clutter. She was the old clutter. On the final day, Clara stood in the doorway of the bedroom, arms crossed, tapping an impatient foot. "The movers are coming this afternoon to take some pieces to auction," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "We'd appreciate it if you were gone by noon." Elara zipped her final suitcase. She stood up, her back aching from the strain of packing and the weight of her grief. She looked around the room one last time. It was already a stranger to her. She walked past Clara without a word, her two suitcases bumping against her legs. She did not look back. She walked out the front door, the heavy oak closing behind her with a soft, final click. The sound of 50 years of her life ending. She called a taxi and went to the cheapest motel she could find on the outskirts of the city. The room was small and smelled of stale smoke and harsh chemical cleaners. The bedspread was thin and scratchy, the single window looking out onto a parking lot and the roaring highway beyond. This was her new reality. She sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress and opened her purse. She pulled out the deed and the brass key. They were all she had. The full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. She was 75 years old. She was homeless. She had a few $1,000s in a personal savings account, money she had painstakingly saved from the modest household allowance Arthur had given her. It would not last long. A wave of fear, cold and vast as the ocean, washed over her. She saw her future stretching out before her, a succession of cheap motel rooms, a life of poverty and insignificance, ending alone and forgotten in some state-run facility. She was invisible. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that had no place for her. The despair was a physical thing, a heavy cloak that threatened to suffocate her. She lay down on the bed and curled into a ball, pulling the scratchy bedspread over her head. She wept. She wept for her lost home, for her lost life, for the man she had loved who had seemingly abandoned her so completely. She wept for the foolish, hopeful young woman she had been, who believed that devotion would be its own reward. She cried until there were no tears left, only a raw, hollow ache in her chest. For 2 days she barely moved. She ate nothing. She spoke to no one. The darkness was absolute. On the third morning, a sliver of sunlight pierced through a gap in the cheap curtains, falling across the nightstand. It illuminated the brass key. The metal seemed to glow with an inner light, a warm, golden promise. Elara sat up, her body stiff and sore. She picked up the key. It was heavy in her hand, real. It was a question that demanded an answer. What was she going to do? Was she going to lie here and fade away, proving Marcus and Clara right? Proving that she was, in fact, nothing without the life they had taken from her? Or was she going to find out what this key was for? A tiny, stubborn spark ignited within her. It was the same spark that had kept her going through 50 years of quiet slights and lonely nights. It was resilience. It was a refusal to be completely extinguished. She had nothing left to lose. The worst had already happened. She looked at the deed again. Port Blossom, the Stargazer's Rest. It was a destination. It was a purpose, however flimsy and absurd it seemed. She got out of bed, her movements slow but deliberate. She showered, washing away the grime of the motel and the stench of despair. She dressed in her cleanest clothes. She went to the bus station and used a significant portion of her remaining savings to buy a one-way ticket to a small town she couldn't even find on most maps. The journey was a slow crawl across the country. The bus moved through endless stretches of farmland, through grimy industrial towns and sprawling suburbs that all looked the same. Elara sat by the window, watching the world go by, feeling utterly disconnected from it. She was a passenger in her own life, heading toward an unknown fate. After 2 days of travel, the landscape began to change. The air grew heavy with the scent of salt and pine. The sky seemed to open up, vast and gray. The bus finally pulled into Port Blossom. It was less a town and more a scattering of weathered buildings clinging to a rocky coastline. A handful of fishing boats bobbed in a small protected harbor. The wind was a constant, powerful presence, whipping off the ocean and carrying the cries of gulls. Elara stepped off the bus, her 2 suitcases at her side. She felt a profound sense of isolation. She was a stranger in a strange land. She asked the bus driver, a weary-looking man with a kind face, if he knew of a place called the Stargazer's Rest. The man's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "The old observatory? Haven't heard anyone ask about that place in years," he said. "It's a few miles up the coast road, perched right on the edge of the cliffs. You can't miss it." He looked at her suitcases and her tired face. "You're not planning on staying there, are you? Place has been abandoned for decades." "I'm just going to look at it," Elara said, her voice quiet. She found a single taxi, an old, rattling station wagon, and paid the driver to take her. The road wound its way up the coastline, with the churning, gray ocean on one side and windswept fields on the other. And then she saw it. It was exactly as the bus driver had described it, a stone cylinder with a rusted, domed roof, standing like a lonely sentinel on the highest point of the cliffs. It looked ancient and forgotten, a ruin from another time. The taxi driver dropped her at the end of a dirt track that led to the building. "This is as far as I go," he said, eyeing the structure with suspicion. "You sure you'll be all right?" "I'll be fine," Elara said, though she wasn't sure at all. She paid him and watched as the taxi rattled back down the road, leaving her alone with the wind and the sea and the derelict building. She dragged her suitcases up the overgrown path. Up close, the observatory was both more intimidating and more beautiful than she had expected. The stonework was masterful, solid, and expertly fitted, weathered by a century of salt and wind, but fundamentally unbroken. The large wooden door was gray and splintered, but it held firm in its iron hinges. Nature was reclaiming the place, with ivy creeping up the walls and wildflowers growing in the cracks of the stone steps. But it did not feel like a place of decay. It felt like a place that was sleeping. There was a large, modern padlock on the door, rusted shut by the sea air. For a moment, her heart sank. But then she noticed a small, almost invisible keyhole in the door itself, just below the main lock. A keyhole of tarnished brass that matched her key perfectly. With a trembling hand, she inserted the key. It slid in smoothly. She turned it. There was a series of soft, satisfying clicks from within the door. She pushed. The heavy door swung inward with a low groan, opening into darkness. She stepped inside, leaving her suitcases on the threshold. The air was cold and musty, thick with the dust of ages. Sunlight streamed through a few grimy windows high up on the curved wall, illuminating a large circular room. In the center of the room, a massive shrouded shape rose up toward the ceiling, the telescope. The rest of the room was sparsely furnished, a few broken chairs, shelves filled with cobweb-covered books, and against the far wall, a large, sturdy-looking wooden desk. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, a gray blanket preserving the scene exactly as it had been left decades ago. Elara walked toward the desk, her footsteps echoing in the vast, silent space. It was a simple, functional piece of furniture, but it was well made. She ran her hand over the dusty surface. She tried the drawers. All of them were unlocked, except for one, a small central drawer right below the desktop. It had a small brass-rimmed lock. Her heart began to beat faster. She pulled the key from the main door and tried it in the desk drawer. It fit. She turned the key, and with another soft click, the drawer unlocked. This was it. The secret. She braced herself for disappointment. She pulled the drawer open. It did not contain gold or jewels or stacks of cash. It contained a single object. A leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with time. It was not what she expected. But as she lifted it from the drawer, she felt a strange sense of significance. A weight that was more than just paper and leather. This was the glimmer of hope. This was the reason she had come all this way. She sat down in the dusty desk chair, the journal in her lap. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was familiar, the elegant, slightly slanted script of her husband, and the words were addressed to her. "My dearest Elara," the entry began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone. And if you are reading this here, in this place, then I must begin with an apology. I am sorry for the fear and the pain you must have just endured. I am sorry for the humiliation. Please, believe me when I say it was a necessary cruelty, and it grieves me more than you can ever know." Elara's hands trembled as she read. This was not the voice of the distant, emotionally reserved man she had known. This was someone else, someone who saw her. She read on, her eyes devouring the words. The journal was a long, continuous letter, written in secret over the course of many years. It was Arthur's confession, his explanation, his final, desperate act of love. He wrote of his weakness, his deep-seated avoidance of conflict that had allowed his children to grow into the greedy, heartless adults they had become. "I saw their natures early on," he wrote. "I saw the coldness in them, the insatiable hunger for what they believed was theirs. I was a coward, Elara. I did not confront them. I chose peace over truth, and in doing so I allowed their poison to spread. It is my greatest failure as a father, and as your husband." He explained the will. He knew, with absolute certainty, that if he had left her anything of obvious value, the house, a portion of the money, Marcus and Clara would have found a way to take it from her. They would have contested the will, bullied her, harassed her until she gave in. They would have left her with nothing. "I could not protect you from them in life," he wrote, the ink slightly smudged as if by a tear. "So I resolved to protect you in death. I had to make them believe they had won everything. I had to make them discard you so that you could be free of them forever. It was the only way." This was his plan, a secret, long-term strategy to save her. The observatory was not a folly, it was her sanctuary. For decades he had been quietly, methodically siphoning funds from his own company, converting his wealth into untraceable assets, gold bullion, bearer bonds, rare investment-grade gemstones. He did it under the guise of eccentric business expenses and failed ventures, a financial sleight of hand so brilliant that no one, not even his own accountants, had ever noticed. He had built a second, secret fortune, a fortune for her. The revelation washed over Elara, a tidal wave of shock and grief and a profound, bone-deep love. He had not forgotten her. He had not abandoned her. He had seen her, truly seen her, and had spent the last 20 years of his life building her a fortress. The journal continued, guiding her. "The wealth is here, my love. It is safe. Go to the main fireplace. On the left side, 3 stones up from the mantel, you will find one that is slightly loose. Press it hard." Elara stood up, her body moving as if in a dream. She went to the massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the observatory. She counted the stones, her fingers tracing the cold, dusty rock. She found it. A single stone that shifted slightly under her touch. She took a deep breath and pushed with all her strength. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low grinding sound of stone on stone, a section of the fireplace wall swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening. A hidden staircase, carved from the rock itself, spiraled down into the darkness of the cliff. A switch was on the wall just inside the opening. Elara flicked it, and a string of bare bulbs illuminated the descent. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She walked down the stone steps, her hand trailing along the cold, damp wall. The air grew cooler, cleaner. The staircase opened into a small, modern-looking antechamber, and set into the far wall was the door to a vault. It was a high-security, bank-grade vault door, a gleaming circle of stainless steel that looked utterly alien in its stone surroundings. On the door was a keypad and a single, ornate keyhole. The keyhole for her brass key. Arthur's journal had given her the code, her birthday. She keyed in the numbers. A green light blinked on. She inserted the brass key and turned. There was a heavy thud of locking mechanisms disengaging. She pulled on the handle, and the massive door swung open with surprising ease. She peered inside. The vault was a large, climate-controlled room, brightly lit by recessed lighting, and it was filled. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with bars of gold bullion, each one stamped with its weight and purity. There were locked cases filled with diamonds, rubies, and emeralds, sparkling with a cold, brilliant fire. There were folders containing bearer bonds worth millions. It was a fortune beyond her wildest imaginings. A fortune that made everything Marcus and Clara had inherited look like pocket change. She sank to her knees on the cold concrete floor, overwhelmed. It was too much to take in. The insult of the single envelope had been a disguise for a gift of unimaginable generosity. The man she thought had betrayed her had, in fact, orchestrated her salvation. But that was not all. On a table in the center of the vault, there was another leather-bound book, this one black, and a thick manila folder next to it. She picked up the folder first. Inside were documents, photocopies of bank statements, offshore account numbers, secret ledgers, and sworn affidavits from disgruntled former employees. It was a mountain of evidence, meticulously gathered, expertly organized proof of years of financial crimes committed by Marcus and Clara. Sections, fraud. Sections, embezzlement from Vance Holdings. Sections, tax evasion on a massive scale. Sections, they had been stealing from their father for years, especially during the final stages of his illness, believing him to be too sick and oblivious to notice. He had noticed everything. He had been watching them, gathering the evidence that would become their downfall. This was the hidden leverage. This was Arthur's checkmate. He had not just given her wealth. He had given her power. The power to protect herself. The power to bring his corrupt children to justice, if she so chose. Elara closed the folder, her mind reeling. She spent the next few weeks in a state of surreal transition. She lived in the observatory, sleeping on a dusty cot she had found, subsisting on canned goods she bought in town. Every day she would read from Arthur's journals, the one he left for her and the black one from the vault, which detailed his investigation into his children. She learned more about her husband in those weeks than she had in 50 years of marriage. She learned about his regrets, his hidden strengths, and the depth of his love and respect for her, a love he had been too guarded to express in person. The despair that had crippled her melted away, burned off by the rising sun of this new reality. It was replaced by a quiet, cold resolve. She was not a victim. She was not a ghost. She was the executor of Arthur's final, brilliant act. Her transformation began. It was not a sudden change, but a slow, steady unfurling. She started to carry herself differently. Her shoulders, once perpetually slumped in a posture of apology, now squared and straight. Her voice, for so long quiet and hesitant, gained a new timbre of calm authority. She began to make plans. She needed help. She walked into Port Blossom, a journey she had made several times for supplies, but this time with a new purpose. She went into the town's general store, a charmingly cluttered place that sold everything from fishing tackle to fresh bread. The owner was a woman about 20 years her junior, with a warm smile and intelligent eyes. Her name was Sarah. "You're the lady who's staying up at the old observatory, aren't you?" Sarah asked, her tone friendly and curious. "I am," Elara said. "My name is Elara Vance." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "Vance? Are you any relation to Arthur Vance? He used to own that place. A quiet man. He'd come into town once or twice a year, ages ago. Always bought a stack of books and a bottle of the good whiskey. Seemed like a decent soul." "He was my husband," Elara said simply. "That was the beginning of a friendship." Sarah, a pillar of the small community, was fascinated by Elara's story, though Elara was careful to leave out the details of the vault. She simply said her husband had left her the property and she intended to restore it. Sarah, who had a deep love for the town's history, was thrilled. She knew everyone. She introduced Elara to a local contractor, a retired architect, an electrician, a plumber. Soon, a small, dedicated team of local workers was ascending the cliff road every morning. Using a small fraction of the funds from the vault, which she had a discreet city lawyer help her legitimize through a holding company Arthur had established, Elara began the restoration of the Stargazer's Rest. The work was methodical and swift. The stone was professionally cleaned, the rusted dome replaced with a new copper one that gleamed in the sun. New windows were installed, the interior was gutted and rebuilt. Modern plumbing and electricity were run up from the town. The observatory was not just being repaired, it was being reborn, transformed into a stunning, modern home that retained its historic soul. And as the building changed, so did Elara. She oversaw the project with a keen eye and a steady hand, making decisions with a confidence that surprised even herself. She was no longer invisible. She was the woman on the cliff, the mysterious benefactor bringing a local landmark back to life. The townspeople, initially wary, grew to respect and admire her. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Marcus and Clara were growing increasingly agitated. The vast fortune they had inherited was proving to be a poison chalice. Arthur, in his meticulous planning, had woven a complex web of legal and financial tripwires. Assets they thought were liquid were tied up in trusts that were difficult to break. And then the audits began. Anonymous tips, sent by Arthur's lawyer on a time delay after his death, had triggered federal investigations into their personal and corporate finances. Their accounts were frozen. Their lawyers were demanding huge retainers to fight a battle they weren't sure they could win. Their stolen paradise was crumbling around them. In their desperation and paranoia, their thoughts turned to the one loose end, Elara, and the one worthless asset they hadn't bothered with, the abandoned observatory. There had to be something there, some hidden value they had missed in their greedy haste. Driven by a combination of suspicion and the hope of finding one last source of cash, they got in Marcus's expensive sedan and drove to Port Blossom. They expected to find Elara living in squalor, a destitute old woman they could easily intimidate into signing over the deed for a few $1,000s. They were not prepared for what they found. As they came up the coastal road, they saw it. The observatory, which they remembered from old family photos as a ruin, was now a magnificent structure, its new copper domes shining like a beacon. The grounds were not overgrown, but beautifully landscaped with native coastal plants. They parked the car, their arrogance faltering, replaced by a confused apprehension. They walked up the new stone pathway to the front door. Before they could knock, the door opened. Elara stood there. She was not the frail, weeping woman they had cast out of their lives. She was wearing a simple but elegant cashmere dress. Her silver hair was beautifully styled, and her posture was as straight and strong as the stone walls around her. Her expression was not one of fear or surprise. It was one of calm, quiet, absolute control. They were stunned into silence. This was the confrontation, and the power had already shifted. "Marcus, Clara," Elara said, her voice smooth and even. "I was wondering when you might arrive." She stepped aside. "Please, come in." They entered hesitantly, their eyes wide as they took in the interior. The vast, circular room was breathtaking. The floors were polished hardwood. The walls were lined with custom-built bookshelves filled with new books, and comfortable, modern furniture was arranged in tasteful groupings. Sections. In the center of the room, the old telescope, now restored to its former glory, pointed up toward a new glass aperture in the dome. It was a space of wealth, taste, and power. Marcus found his voice first, a strained, incredulous squeak. What is all this? Where did you get the money for this? Arthur was a more thoughtful man than you ever gave him credit for, Elara said, gesturing toward a pair of armchairs. Sit. It was a command, not a request. They sat. Clara, recovering her composure, adopted her familiar sneer. Whatever little nest egg father hid for you here, it belongs to the estate, to us. This property, this house, it's ours. We've come for the deed. Elara looked at them, a long, silent appraisal. She felt a flicker of something, not anger, but a sad, detached pity for their smallness, for the greed that was so ingrained it was the only language they knew. I don't think you're in a position to demand anything, she said softly. She walked over to the desk, the same desk where she had found Arthur's journal. She picked up a thin folder. It was not the folder from the vault. It was a summary. She placed it on the coffee table in front of them. I believe you'll want to look at this, she said. Marcus snatched it up, his face a mask of suspicion. He opened it. Clara leaned over his shoulder to read. Elara watched as the color drained from their faces. The folder contained a concise, point-form summary of their crimes. Dates, amounts, account numbers. A list of witnesses prepared to testify. A concluding page that estimated their criminal liability in terms of fines and prison sentences. Decades. It would be decades. Marcus's hands began to shake, the papers rattling. Clara sank back into her chair, her mouth hanging open, her carefully constructed facade completely shattered. This is blackmail, Marcus stammered, his voice thin with panic. You can't prove any of this. Oh, I can, Elara said, her voice still impossibly calm. The full evidence is extensive, meticulously documented, and stored in a very secure location. That is just the table of contents. Your father was a brilliant man, and he was very, very disappointed in you. The final checkmate. They were trapped, utterly and completely. They looked at her, their eyes wide with a terror that was, for Elara, profoundly unsatisfying to witness. She let the silence stretch, letting the reality of their ruin sink in. Then she laid out her terms. Here is what is going to happen, she said, her voice clear and non-negotiable. My lawyer has drawn up some documents. You will sign them. You will relinquish any and all claims to this property and any other assets connected to the name Arthur Vance. You will also transfer the sum of $20 million from an accessible account to a trust that I have established. It is a fraction of what you stole, but it will be enough. Marcus started to protest, but she held up a hand, silencing him. In return for your full and immediate cooperation, she continued, the complete file on your criminal activities will remain sealed. You will then leave this place, and you will disappear from my life forever. If I ever see or hear from you again, if you ever make any trouble for me or this community, that file will be delivered to the United States Attorney's Office. Do you understand? They could only nod, their arrogance replaced by a groveling, desperate fear. They had no choice. They had been so sure of their victory, so confident in their own cleverness, that they had never once considered they could be outmaneuvered. They had underestimated their father, and they had underestimated her. The lawyer Elara had hired, a sharp, no-nonsense woman from the city, arrived an hour later with the papers. Marcus and Clara signed everything without a word, their hands guided by the specter of a long prison sentence. The wire transfer was initiated, and then it was over. They left the observatory, their shoulders slumped in defeat, their faces gray with the ashes of their greed. They got into their expensive car, which now seemed like a hollow symbol of a life they had already lost, and drove away. Elara watched them go until the car was just a speck on the horizon. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel joy. She felt a quiet, profound sense of peace. It was the peace of a story finding its proper end. The aftermath was quiet and swift. Marcus and Clara were ruined. The 20 million they had transferred gutted what was left of their stolen fortune. The ongoing federal audits and legal fees consumed the rest. They had to sell the grand house, the art, the city properties, all to cover their debts. They faded into a disgraced and bitter obscurity, a footnote in the story of the Vance family. Elara never heard from them again. Her new beginning started the very next day. She was now in full control of her life and of a fortune so vast it could reshape the world in small, meaningful ways. She knew exactly what she wanted to do. It was a purpose that had been growing in her heart ever since she first read Arthur's journal. With the help of Sarah and a board of trustees she appointed, she used the transferred funds and a portion of the vault's assets to establish a foundation. She called it the Arthur Vance Foundation for Celestial Arts. The observatory, the Stargazer's Rest, became its headquarters and its heart. It was not to be her private home. It was to be a sanctuary. She transformed the property into a world-class retreat, a residency for those who, like her, had been overlooked and underestimated. Sections. She funded grants for scientists from underrepresented backgrounds, scholarships for artists struggling to find their voice, and fellowships for writers whose stories needed to be told. Sections. The Stargazer's Rest became a place of inspiration and creation. Sections. Its rooms were filled with the light of new ideas and the quiet hum of focused work. Elara was its gentle, guiding presence. She was not the owner, but the custodian. She had found a purpose far greater than personal wealth or vindication. She was building a legacy, not of money, but of opportunity. One evening, a year after the confrontation, Elara stood on the observatory's wide, newly built balcony. The sun had set, and the sky was a deep velvet black, studded with 1 billion glittering stars. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of the sea and the sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs far below. She was no longer the invisible woman who had existed in the quiet spaces. She had found her own space, a place of strength and significance. She thought of Arthur, not with the lingering pain of his distance, but with a deep and abiding gratitude. He had given her a second life, a chance to become the person she was always meant to be. Her worth was not defined by the family she had served or the husband she had loved. It was defined by the resilience she had discovered within herself, the dignity she had reclaimed, and the purpose she was now building with her own 2 hands. She looked up at the vast, star-strewn canvas of the night sky. For 50 years she had made herself small, folding her dreams away. Now, under the infinite expanse of the cosmos, she finally felt her own spirit expand to fill the space she had claimed. She was not a survivor. She was a creator. She was a benefactor. She was Elara Vance, and she was finally, peacefully, home. The peace she felt was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of purpose. It was a quiet, steady flame that warmed her from the inside out, a light that no one could ever extinguish again. She had found her true self, not in the inheritance of wealth, but in the creation of a meaningful life on her own terms, a life dedicated to helping others find their own light in the darkness.